Hi, my name is Bruno Soares de Santos. I'm a master's student at the University of Alberta here in Canada. First and foremost, I would like to thank the event organizers for the opportunity of presenting this research project here, and I would also like to thank everyone who is watching this presentation and engaging in the discussion. I really appreciate your time and presence, even if virtually. The presentation I will be making today is part of a broader project that touches on the changes in the international reception of Brazilian literature in the 21st century, which resulted in a larger visibility for some Brazilian authors such as Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis and Clarice Lispector in the Anglophone context. However, for this presentation, I will be limiting myself to the case of Lispector, and even my discussion on Lispector will be limited to avoid digressions in this limited time presentation. Also, I've decided to present in English precisely because this project is originally being conducted in this specific language. As we all know, in Brazil, Lispector occupies a significant position as one of the most important authors in the country's literary tradition. However, as historically, Brazilian literature itself struggles to find a place in the world literary scene, as scholars such as Piers Armstrong, Earl Feats, Irene Rostaño, and among others have noted, Lispector remained not widely known to the general readership in the English-speaking milieu, and for a long time, the Bahia-born author Jorge Amado was pointed out as the only canonical Brazilian writer with editorial prestige internationally. Nevertheless, we have been noticing a Lispector's revival. What has objectively changed in the reception of this Ukrainian-Brazilian writer that now starts to be more extensively read in the English-speaking world? Well, since 2009, Lispector has been the subject of a biography originally published in the Anglophone context, Why This World? A Biography of Clarice Lispector, by American author Benjamin Moser, issued by Oxford University Press and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Since this publication, more than a dozen of books by Lispector were retranslated, republished, or published for the first time in English, including a luxury collection of her short stories and two different editions of her famous novel The Hour of the Star, being one of them a special anniversary edition. These books have been widely well received by critics, entering prestigious lists like the New York Times 100 Notable Books. The complete stories, published by New Directions in 2015, with remarkable translations by Katrina Dodson, has, for Dodson's work in this anthology, been awarded with the 2016 Penn Translation Prize and other recognitions. My project aims to interpret Moser's endeavor under the light of existing theories on world literature. In this specific case, I am working with David Damrosch's theories of world literature as a mode of reading and of circulation, in order to answer what has changed in this new strategy regarding the international promotion of Lispector that allowed it to project her work like never before. This is important because it contributes to the understanding of how Lispector, who is one of the most important writers ever produced in Latin America, took so long to achieve a clearer prestige beyond her home country, and why has it changed now? David Damrosch's concept of world literature does not refer to some sort of canon nor every single piece of literature ever written in the world. World literature for him is more about the circulation of literary texts and the ways of reading them. It can be, quote, any literary works that circulate beyond its home base and is actively present within a literary system beyond that of its original culture, end quote. However, for him, world literature is, quote, always as much about the host culture's values and needs as it is about a work's source culture. And a work of world literature has its fullest life and its greatest power when we can read it with a kind of detached engagement, even as we adapt it to our present context and purposes, end quote. Therefore, international literary success comes easier when a traveling work understands that a space beyond its own national scope is, quote, a space defined in many ways by the host culture's national tradition and the present needs of its own writers, end quote. A work can exist as world literature in a foreign literary system as both a positive or a negative example of literature but the ideal scenario is being considered as, quote, a positive model for the future development of its, in this case, the host culture's own tradition, end quote. The Amherst ideas apply to Moser's project because, as I argue, Moser has created a new literary persona for Clarice Lispector, one that is more appealing for international audiences. My argument is that in order to create this persona, Moser walked the following path. Firstly, he gave this persona a story, a place in history. This was achieved through the writing of and publication of the 2009 biography and its massive advertising, not only in academic circles, but above all in important media outlets. I show how this biography intends to place Clarice Lispector as a remarkable Jewish author, inserted in the context of the Jewish collective trauma and diaspora. In order to demonstrate that, I've conducted a reading of Moser's biography alongside with texts published by him in other mediums, such as websites and news outlets, in which he promotes an interpretation of both Lispector's life and work under the light of Jewish traditions, and through comparison between her and other important Jewish historical characters. By doing this, Moser's project dialogues with the theories that Damrosch formulates on the circulation of world literature, that Clarice Lispector should be more than just an important Brazilian author and be presented in a more internationally appealing package for foreign audiences. The Jewish community is present all over the globe, and there is an important scope of worldwide famous Jewish authors such as Frank Kafka, Baruch Spinoza, Marcel Proust, among many others. By presenting Clarice Lispector as an essentially Jewish writer, Moser positions her work as a gap in the history of the Jewish literary tradition and as an important source for further understanding of how the persecution against Jewish people affected worldwide literature. Secondly, Moser gave this persona, this new Clarice persona, a new unified voice. I argue that this step was achieved through the series of retranslations that he promoted alongside New Directions and other young translators. Although I might not have time in this presentation to go further in the specifics of these translations, Moser has declared that previous translators of Lispector were not capable of capturing her unique, strange voice, and for him, this, among other reasons, was due to the lack of organization in the way her translations were made. There were many unconnected people translating her work, such as Elizabeth Bishop, Gregory Rabassa, and Giovanni Pontiero, and these, he thinks, would have led to a lack of unification in Lispector's literary voice, which would be solved by this new project in which, although there would be many translators working on different texts, all of them would be under his supervision. And now a brief parenthesis. Although this would be a bit of a digression for this occasion, in my project I also note with more details that Moser's search for Lispector's uniqueness resembles in many ways Walter Benjamin's concept of aura, as it involves a search for Lispector's singularity as an author and her work's, quote, embeddedness in the context of tradition, end quote. My hypothesis is that by building this new literary persona for Clarice Lispector, Moser wanted to make her work more relevant for international audiences and literary traditions. By placing her in time and history, by inserting her in an existing and relevant literary tradition, and by searching for what he sees as her true and unique voice, Moser seems to be trying to 1. Turn Clarice's work into a more successful piece of world literature in Damrosch's terms, and 2. Approach Lispector's English version to what would be the true aura of her work, if there is such a thing. Before moving to some of my examples and evidence, I would like to clarify that I am not saying that Clarice Lispector has not appeared as a Jewish author in scholarly production before. Both Professor Nelson Vieira and Naomi Lindstrom, for example, have looked into the work of Lispector under the light of the Jewish tradition and the Jewish history. Nor am I saying that Lispector has never been read outside Brazilianist circles before, as I am aware of her success among international feminist critics in the 20th century. What is different in Moser's case, however, is the dimension and the structure of his project, and the fact that it has achieved a wider readership outside academia, as he got the most out of mainstream media sources to advertise and complement his work, taking his version of Lispector beyond academic discussion. Talking about Why This World, the whole biography is guided by a Jewish interpretation of Lispector's life and work, but not only through the simple presence of information on Lispector's origins. It is how Moser interprets these facts on Lispector's origins that is very illuminating about the character he is trying to build. There are many examples of passages I could bring, but I will select a few to present here. One of the key narratives in Moser's biography is an alleged rape that Lispector's mother, Manya, who by the end of her life was paralytic, would have suffered from Russian authorities during the period of pogroms in their homeland. As a consequence of this rape, Manya would have contracted syphilis. For Moser, Lispector would have been born then to save her mother from the disease, based on a belief from their homeland in Ukraine, in which that said that a baby could save a mother that was sick from syphilis. His theories are not only based on a confession that Lispector would have made to a friend, but also on Lispector's literature itself. He cites, for example, the 1968 Crônica named Pertencer, in which Lispector writes on the feeling of unbelonging, and in which he writes a passage that says, quote, "No entanto, fui preparada para ser dada à luz de modo tão bonito. Minha mãe já estava doente, e por uma superstição bastante espalhada, acreditava-se que ter um filho curava uma mulher de uma doença. Então fui deliberadamente criada, com amor e esperança, só que não curei minha mãe." End quote. By linking her literature to this local Ukrainian belief, Moser also links Clarice Lispector to her past in Ukraine, as if the traumas of the Jewish persecution had not only determined some of her literary themes, but had also determined her existence itself. These themes of her past, for Moser, would have haunted Lispector throughout her life and appear in many other pieces by her. This way, Moser does not only insert Lispector's work into the Jewish context by conducting a biographical reading of her work, he also inserts her into a Jewish literary tradition by comparing her work to the ones of other Jewish writers while making, as well, a comparison with their biographical trajectory. Two cases are the comparison he makes between Clarice Lispector and Spinoza and Clarice Lispector and Kafka. Regarding Spinoza, Moser points out that Lispector dialogues directly with the Dutch philosopher in many of its themes, especially when it comes to the nature of God, and especially in her novel Perto do Coração Selvagem. The biographer writes that, quote, "In Clarice Lispector's writings, there are echoes of another great Jewish thinker, another product of his exile, who faced the death of God and sought to recreate a moral universe in his absence." End quote. For Moser as well, Lispector's interest in Spinoza and the echoes it makes in her work are also a way of trying to understand her own past, the reasons for her birth, and her origins. He cites, for example, a translation of Coração Selvagem, in which Lispector writes that God's perfection is proven more by the impossibility of miracles than by their possibility. For the humanized God of the religions, to perform miracles is to commit an injustice. End quote. After highlighting the excerpt, Moser introduces a biographical interpretation for it. Quote, "Perhaps Clarice was thinking of her mother's as she wrote these lines, remembering her own failure to generate a miracle. The idea that a conscious God have saved someone else instead might have been unbearable." End quote. Regarding Kafka, Moser presents him as an author who, like Lispector, did not explicitly touch on things Jewish in his literature, and yet both of the writings were haunted by the themes related to their religion's background. Quote, "It is perhaps in Kafka where one feels with the greatest intensity the Jewish despair at the loss of God. Clarice Lispector's renunciation of God in this context was no more than a reflection of a loss that the Jewish world as a whole had experienced." End quote. Even though there is not enough time to discuss it here, Moser also reads in other passages, Lispector's literature under the light of the Jewish mythology, for example. And by pointing out her literary dialogue with Jewish traditional stories, or with figures like characters like Spinoza and Kafka, for example, he's also positioning her work in a Jewish literary tradition. If we think of such an approach in Damrosch's terms, we will see that by doing that, Moser could open a gap in what some readers may understand as Jewish literature, since he is presenting for some a new but still widely influential writer of Jewish descent, who not only inserts aspects of her own Jewish experience in her literature, but also builds a dialogue with other Jewish stories, thoughts, or narratives that have circulated very successfully as world literature. Well, when it comes to insertions in media venues beyond academia, Moser, for example, adapted the introduction he wrote for the anthology The Complete Stories into the article The True Glamour of Clarice Lispector for the New Yorker magazine. In this piece, Lispector is as well presented as an essentially Jewish writer in her style, themes, and manners. Even Lispector's unique use of language here is presented as a consequence of her background. Quote, "New subjects require new language. Part of Clarice's odd grammar can be traced to the powerful influence of the Jewish mysticism that her father introduced to her." End quote. In this piece, Moser also affirms that Lispector's roots in Jewish mysticism is the essentially spiritual impulse that animated her work. End quote. Also, he highlights the connection between her interest in language and her interest in what, for lack of a better word, she called God. End quote. Moser has also given many interviews on his work and has written an article for the website Publishing Perspective in 2011 in which he describes his retranslation project of Lispector. But in the international press, Moser's biography was very well advertised, receiving numerous reviews, many of them interested in Lispector's Jewish roots, as in the following example. In a New York Times book review, Fernanda Abstad declares that, quote, "Moser's, despite Lispector's avoidance of overt reference to Jewishness, places her firmly in the tradition of the Jewish mystics who were driven by historical cataclysm and personal trauma to create their own theology from God's absence." End quote. This, it is worth noticing, was not the only article that the New York Times published about the book, with another piece by Dwight Gardner, published days before. In this piece, Gardner basically builds a profile for Lispector, which is largely based on the biographer's view of her, on Moser's view of her. He affirms, without casting any doubt, that, quote, "Lispector's mother was raped by Russian soldiers and contracted syphilis," end quote. These two pieces, by Times, review how the book came out in a good regard, not only because it had two different long articles dedicated to it in one of the most important papers in the world, but also because such articles' authors, they trust in Moser's work, echoing with their lines the same version of Lispector that Moser writes about. Other media venues keep the same trend. Spectator's Ian Thompson, for example, published a review named "She's the Most Important Jewish Writer Since Kafka," where Clarice's Jewish past and exile is explored to build her character. Thompson's title shows how Moser's comparison between Kafka and Lispector seems to have worked, as the title makes clear. Here, Thompson shows perplexity before such an important Jewish writer of which he had never heard of. In addition, all of the publications made by Moser and by New Directions regarding Lispector in these recent years have received a significantly large number of publications in media venues such as Los Angeles Review of Books, Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, London Review of Books, Globe and Mail, among several others. Still, this presentation gives a limited overview of my original research, in which I conclude, among other things, that Moser's project was able to bring new winds into the story of Lispector as a world literature author. Basing myself in the theories formulated by David Damrosch, I highlight how the steps Moser followed were an effort to position Lispector within another literary tradition outside the Brazilian one. There are examples of Jewish literature in different nationalities. Placing Lispector as a Jewish writer who not only contributes to understand the shared pain, trauma, and diaspora of the Jewish community around the world, but also dialogues with other writers of Jewish origin, can reinforce her role as a positive model for the future development of different host cultures, and make her circulate better in a space defined in many ways by the host culture's national tradition, while fulfilling the present needs of its own writers, as Damrosch affirms in his theories. Nonetheless, having his own very clear vision of what Lispector represents as an author, as exemplified in his writings about her, including the biography, Moser has also helped bringing together a very organized advertising project for Lispector, one that was probably never seen before in the history of Brazilian literature. But there is something that should not be taken for granted. The fact that more than a researcher, a scholar, Moser is a talented marketer. He was able to circulate among media outlets and make them publish on the work of an author who was virtually unknown in circles outside academia, leading Lispector to a closer match between her popularity in academia and her popularity in sales and in market recognition. We can see that there is for sure a new space being made for this author in world literature. Thank you.